Chag Sameach. I once heard a story that I saw became a book. We eventually, during COVID, invited the author to come here to the synagogue, and she spoke to us, Dr. Kaysen, Yvonne Kaysen. But it's an incredible story featuring several experienced students. And she was called to serve. She lived in Canada, a small community, a native community in the far reaches of Ontario. And it was winter time. And as she was serving there as a resident in her final years of becoming a doctor, one night she was assigned to accompany someone, a patient who was in critical condition, on a small plane to the nearest city in Winnipeg. It was a very small plane with two small engines, and they hit a storm. And then in the midst of this storm, the weather got worse and worse and worse. And finally, both engines stopped working, and the plane began to descend. And she talked about the feeling we can all imagine she had as that was happening. Oy vey. And then finally the plane crashed onto a frozen lake, but the pilot managed to land it well enough that the plane was intact. But then suddenly the ice started to break, and the plane began to sink into the water. She said at that moment, suddenly all of her fear, all of her intense panic suddenly was replaced by a feeling of peace and an inner voice that told her, be still. And she and the nurse started to try and save the critically ill patient, but the pilot just yelled at them, get out of the plane. And they got out of the plane, and the moment they stepped out of the plane just sunk deep down into the bottom of the lake. And then she started to swim to shore. She had heavy winter clothes on and heavy winter boots on. And that's when she was falling under the water several times and struggling, when the experience that she was having deepened and it became what is called a near-death experience, an NDE. She said she heard what sounded like the rushing sound of water. And then suddenly she was swimming, but she felt at the same time like her consciousness was far up above her, and she was looking down, seeing herself from above, and felt struggling to get to shore. You can imagine in those conditions. Somehow her spirit was lifted higher and higher into a realm of light, looking down, and she felt an incredible love. She said, at that moment I knew whether that body survived or died, that she would live on, and that she was incredibly loved by this higher power, loving force of the universe, and she felt at that moment that she was home. She made it to the shore, and she was brought to the hospital and put into a very warm bath. And suddenly she heard that rushing sound again, and it felt like she went back into her body. She said it felt like a genie sucked back into the bottle, suddenly in terrible, awful pain. And it took her a while to recover. But she started to try talking to colleagues about what had happened to her, and they all just dismissed it, until finally she spoke to someone who had a religious side and said, well, what you had might have been a mystical experience. And suddenly she understood. And it took years, but this eventually transformed her life. And it was not easy at first, because it wasn't where all of her habits and behaviors, and she had to integrate it. But the world looked so different to her that it automatically began to integrate. There was nothing else that could happen. And slowly, slowly, she shifted her life, and it transformed her understanding of who she was, of what her life was about, where she should put her energies. And she made a reorientation of her whole life, her thoughts, her actions, all of it. We often think of this story of the crossing of the Red Sea, which is the subject of the last few days of Passover as the greatest miracle that befell the Jewish people at the end of all the plagues, the greatest miracle of all of it, of all of our history. And it was a powerful miracle. In the midst of losing all hope of the Egyptian army racing towards them with Pharaoh and the sea before them, the sea itself parted up into massive walls of water, and the people walked through and saw their enemies drowned, defeated, gone, their power reduced to nothing. But the sea were also taught Ra'ah Shivcha, a handmaid saw, what even the prophet Yechezkel, Ezekiel, did not. And Ezekiel is a prophet with the most intense and wild visions in the whole of our book of prophets. So it's telling us the people were also taking into such a mystical, powerful experience. And the Midrash imagines that the people were completely in a different state. They were walking through the sea, and whatever food they thought of just materialized in front of them. And Rabbi Natan of Nemirov says they were walking on dry land, but really he says they were taken out of time and space. They were in some place completely other. Right? During the other miracles that happened in Egypt, the wonders, the people were just witnessing what was happening. They were given something that was very different. It was a completely other experience of going through the wonder. And it wasn't as if they were waiting for it or praying or meditating. It just suddenly came upon them, this experience. And it's why they burst into song, with Miriam leading the way as we read. And we can imagine with what they were feeling, just thinking about Dr. Kaysen's experience, how what may have been feeling the love of the Creator and being taken out of all of it and out of their bodies. How could you explain such powerful feelings? Only song. And so it was a kind of song that thousands of years later people still think about, a song that comes out of pure inspiration, that wells up from within. And there's no more exalted song in the whole of our scriptures. And the most beautiful music in general comes from that place. So we still cherish the words. If only we had the melody, what would it sound like? And the experience was even more to them in that moment. It was a first experience that they had of meeting their God, of transcendence, and one that would eventually lead them to the even greater experience of Mount Sinai and the real purpose of them leaving Eden. Over many times to integrate some of what they were experiencing, that there was a God of love out there, as the Midrash says, a universe that takes care of them, and that there's a different way of living life, different values that they knew when they were in Egypt, different way of being. Not always so easy to hold on to that, as we see, still not so easy to hold on to. But once they tasted it, it was within them. However long it would take, they would slowly work its way to it, if they also were prepared to put in the work to make it theirs. And after all their lives as slaves, suddenly we can imagine that everything in that moment suddenly made sense. Who had time to think about it before? But that transcendent moment took them to a place where suddenly they understood their lives, the story, the arc of the Jewish people, what it was all about, their past, their future, their present, the might of their God and the weakness of Pharaoh and their taskmasters and the Egyptians. And it changed how they looked at everything in the world. Then they had to learn to integrate it. And so too, every year we read this story, we think about it in these days, to also pray for those experiences in our own lives, in the lives of our nation, of all the world, where suddenly we can be taken out of it and shown with truth the nature of the universe, where love and spirit and song well up from within in spontaneous joy. We are transported far away and are given with God's help a new vision of our own life that transforms us, and over days and weeks and years transforms everything we know about how we live and see and experience and bring love into our universe. Chag Sameach.